2. My Amish wife asked me to hold our baby. I walked away because my father was watching Rebecca hands me our daughter. She's 3 days old, and her fingers are still curled tight like she's holding something invisible, something she brought with her. The kitchen smells like the red raspberry leaf tea Ma'am had been steeping since before dawn. That dark, earthy smell, almost like wet bark. Nothing sweet about it. Rebecca's hands are shaking. Not a lot, just enough that I notice the cup rattling against the saucer when she sets it down. I take the baby, I hold her against my chest, and I can feel her whole rib cage moving, this tiny bellows, and for maybe 4 seconds I am just a man holding his child, and the wood stove is ticking, and the January wind is pressing on the glass, and nothing in the world is wrong. Then I hear the boot on the porch step. Dat's boot. And something in me, I don't know what to call it, something older than thinking. It locks my arms. I hand the baby back to Rebecca so fast she almost doesn't catch her. I step away from my wife. I step toward the sink like I have something to do there. And I stand with my back to both of them, washing a glass that was already clean because my father is about to walk through that door, and where I come from, a man does not stand in the kitchen holding a newborn like the world has stopped. Not in front of his dat. Not if he wants to be the kind of son his father raised. I was 26 years old, and I didn't yet know that the tea cooling on that table, the one my mother had carried through the snow that morning, was about to undo 40 years of silence between my father and me. Quick pause. My name is Joseph, and this is Rebecca's husband. If these stories stay with you, if they remind you of something the old ones knew, subscribe. It's free, and it's the reason I can keep telling them. Tell me in the comments, was there a remedy in your family that carried more than medicine? Something that healed what nobody was willing to name out loud? And if you want to go further, a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me, these old ways are worth remembering. That keeps this going. Now, back to what happened. Rebecca didn't say anything when I handed the baby back. She didn't have to. I saw her jaw set, that small tightening she does when she's swallowing something she'll bring up later, or maybe never. But right then, Dat was stamping the snow off his boots on the porch, and I could hear him coughing the way he'd been coughing since October. That deep, wet sound, like something was living in his chest and refusing to leave. He came through the door smelling like wood smoke and cold air and the lanolin from the sheep he'd been checking on. He didn't look at the baby first. He looked at me, then at the sink. Then he gave one nod, like I'd passed something, and that nod, I carried it. I carried it the way you carry a stone in your pocket you keep reaching for without knowing why. See, where I grew up, in our community outside of Belleville, the Kishokokias Valley, where the farms sit so tight against the mountains you can hear the creek from almost any field. A man's softness was something you kept between you and God, maybe between you and your wife, if the door was closed. But you did not show it in front of your father, and your father did not show it in front of his. That was the rule. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody had to. It was in the way Dat stood at the table, always last to sit, first to bow his head, hands flat on the wood like he was holding the whole house in place. It was in the way Gross-Daddy Eli, Dat's father, once told me that a man's hands were made for work and for prayer, and that anything else was fur-hoodled nonsense. I was maybe 9 when he said that. We were stripping tobacco leaves in the shed behind the barn, the one with the east-facing door that never latched right, and I'd been holding a barn cat against my chest. Gross-Daddy didn't yell. He just looked at me until I put the cat down. That was enough. I didn't pick it up again, not when he was watching. But there was another rule in our house, a quieter one, and it lived on the women's side of things, though I didn't understand that until much later. The women healed. The men endured. That was the way. When someone got sick, a child with croup, a husband with a fever that wouldn't break, an old man whose joints had swollen past bending, it wasn't the men who moved first. It was Ma'am, or Gross Mammy, or Rebecca, after we married. They had the teas, the tinctures, the poultices made from things that grew in the fields we walked past every day without seeing. Comfrey for the bones, mullein steeped in olive oil for earaches, yarrow packed into a cut that wouldn't close, and red raspberry leaf, That was the women's plant. Ma'am called it defragrout, the woman's herb. She brewed it for every birth, every monthly trouble, every time a new mother's body needed pulling back together. I'd seen the dark reddish water in the pot my entire life, and I never once asked what it was for. A son doesn't ask about such things, or he didn't, in our house. I just knew that when that smell filled the kitchen, that mineral, almost iron taste you could feel in the back of your throat just from breathing near it, something was happening that belonged to the women, and I was supposed to look away. The week Rebecca was due with our first, Ma'am came to stay. She brought a canvas bag so heavy I thought she'd packed canning jars. She had, but not food. Tinctures. Dried nettle leaf in a muslin pouch. I remember it was tied with a piece of white string that had a knot so small I don't know how her fingers managed it. A brown glass bottle of something she never labeled, just kept on the second shelf of the hutch, behind the good plates. A jar of raw honey from Amos Byler's hives, the dark kind, almost black, from the late goldenrod flow. And the raspberry leaf, dried, crumbled, stored in a tin that had once held butter cookies. She didn't explain any of it to me. She explained it to Rebecca. I heard them sometimes at night, after I'd gone up to bed, Ma'am's voice low and steady through the floorboards, and Rebecca asking questions I couldn't quite make out. The sound of a spoon against a pot, the creak of a cabinet. I lay there staring at the ceiling beams, the ones I'd planed myself that spring, white oak, still smelling faintly of the tree, and I thought, this is how it's always been. The women carry the knowing, the men carry the silence, and somehow it works. Our daughter came on a Tuesday, January 7th. Rebecca labored for 11 hours in the back bedroom with Ma'am and the midwife, Sarah Yoder, a small woman, maybe 5'2", with hands so steady you'd think she was threading a needle, not bringing a child into the world. I was in the kitchen. That's where the men wait. I could hear Rebecca through the wall. Not screaming, she barely screamed, but these low sounds, almost like humming, that made my hands shake so bad I dropped my coffee mug and it broke clean in half on the floor. I just stared at the two pieces. I didn't pick them up for an hour. When the crying started, the baby's crying, it was so thin and high it didn't sound human. It sounded like something the wind would make through a cracked window. And then Ma'am opened the door. She had blood on her apron. Her face was calm, but her eyes were wet. She said, "Du hast den Mädel. You have a girl." And she handed me a cup of that tea, the raspberry leaf, and said, "Bring this to your wife. Make sure she drinks it all." That was the first time in my life Ma'am gave me a direct instruction about a remedy. I carried that cup down the hall like it was communion wine. Rebecca drank it, all of it. She was gray in the face. I don't mean pale, I mean gray, the color of the sky before a bad snow. And her lips were dry and cracked, and she kept licking them like she couldn't get enough water in the world. The baby was on her chest. I stood in the doorway. Sarah Yoder was washing her hands in the basin, and she looked at me and nodded toward Rebecca like, "Go on, then." So I went. I sat on the edge of the bed, which Ma'am had covered with old sheets we didn't care about ruining, and I put my hand on Rebecca's arm. Her skin was hot. Not fever hot, effort hot, like she'd been hauling hay in August. She looked at me and said, "I remember this exactly." She said, "She has your ears, Joseph." And I laughed. I actually laughed, because I have terrible ears, too big, stick out a little on the left side, and Rebecca always teased me about them. And in that moment, in that room that smelled like iron and sweat and raspberry leaf, and the kerosene lamp that was hissing slightly because the wick needed trimming, in that moment I was not my father's son. I was just a man whose wife had just done the hardest thing a body can do, and she was making a joke about ears, and I loved her so completely that my chest ached like I'd been hit. Then the porch step creaked. Dat. 3 days later he came in, and Ma'am had the tea going again. She made it every morning that first week. A fresh pot, and she'd add just a little honey and a pinch of dried nettle, said it would help Rebecca's milk come in strong. Dat sat at the table. He didn't take his coat off right away, which meant he wasn't staying long, or he wanted to look like he wasn't staying long. He asked about the baby's weight. He asked if the cord had fallen off yet. He did not ask to hold her. He did not ask how Rebecca was feeling. These were not questions men in my family asked. I stood at the sink, still standing at that sink with the clean glass in my hand, and I watched him look at the tea on the table, and something crossed his face. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. Like he was remembering something he hadn't thought about in 30 years. He reached out and touched the pot, just laid his hand flat against the side of it, feeling the warmth. And then he pulled it back and looked at his palm like it had told him something. "Your mam made this for your mother," he said. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at his hand. "After you were born, same tea, same pot." He paused, and I waited. No, wait. It wasn't a pause, he stopped, like the sentence had a wall at the end of it. He rubbed the callus on his right thumb, over and over. Then he said, "I never told her it mattered. I should have told her it mattered." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My father had never— Give me a second. My father had never, in 26 years, spoken about my mother's remedies as though they were anything other than women's business. Background noise. Kitchen work. And here he was, in my kitchen, with his hand still half reaching toward a pot of raspberry leaf tea, telling me he carried a regret. A small one, maybe the size of a sentence never spoken, but he carried it. And then the thing I didn't expect. He looked at me, straight at me, and he said, "Go hold your daughter, Joseph. That's all." 4 words. He said them the way he'd say, "Close the gate," or "Check the south fence." Plain, like it was nothing. But his voice cracked on, "Daughter." Just barely. Just enough that I heard the whole history of the men in my family, the ones who loved hard and held quiet and never once let their sons see it. I heard all of it break, just a little, on that one word. I put the glass down. I walked over to Rebecca, and I picked up my baby, and I held her against my chest, and my father watched me do it. He didn't look away. He didn't nod. He just watched. And Ma'am stood in the doorway with the nettle and the honey and the dried leaves in her hands, and she was crying without making a sound, and nobody said anything for a long time. I think about that morning more than I should. I think about how close I came to never hearing those 4 words. If Dad hadn't touched that pot, if Ma'am hadn't made that tea, if the smell of it hadn't unlocked whatever door he'd kept shut since the day I was born. The remedy wasn't just for Rebecca's body. It wasn't just the raspberry leaf pulling her uterus back together, or the nettle building her iron, or the honey easing her throat. It was the smell of it. The ritual of it, the way it sat on the table like a bridge between the world the women kept and the world the men pretended didn't exist. That tea was a language, and my father, for one morning, let himself hear it. I didn't understand then what I understand now, that the silence between fathers and sons in our community wasn't cruelty, it was inheritance. Dad's father never told him it was all right to be soft. Gross-Daddy Eli's father never told him. You go back far enough and you find a man standing in a field in Switzerland or Germany, jaw set against the wind, holding everything inside because the world outside was trying to break him, and the only defense he knew was to become stone. That stone got passed down, generation to generation, not with words, with posture, with the way a man holds his shoulders when his son walks into the room, with what he doesn't say when the baby cries. Dad wasn't withholding love. He was giving me the only version of it he'd ever received, and neither of us knew. Neither of us had the language for what was missing. The women had the language. They had the raspberry leaf and the nettle, and the laying on of hands and the low voices through the floorboards at night. They had braucherai, not the word. Most of us didn't use that word, but the practice, the quiet magic of knowing which plant healed which wound. They passed it mother to daughter the way the men passed silence father to son. He wasn't a hard man. I need you to understand that. He did what his father did. None of us knew different. And the thing I learned later, the thing that would have changed everything if someone had said it out loud, is this. Those remedies Ma'am carried weren't just medicine for the body. They were the only emotional infrastructure our community had. The tea on the table wasn't just postpartum care. It was the women's way of saying, "We see you. We know what you just went through. Your body matters. Your pain matters." And the men, we had nothing like that. No tea, no tincture, no ritual that said, "You're allowed to feel this." The closest Dat ever came was touching that pot. One hand. 5 seconds. And even that took him 26 years. After that morning, something shifted. Not big, not the way it happens in stories where everything changes at once. More like a fence post that leans 1 degree further each season until one spring you notice it's been leaning for years and you just never look straight at it. Dat started coming by more. Not every day. He had his own farm to run. 63 acres of corn and hay and the sheep that were always getting through the south fence, no matter how many times he patched it. But he came. He'd sit at our kitchen table, and he'd hold his coffee with both hands, and he'd watch Rebecca move through the room with the baby on her hip, and he wouldn't say much. But he'd stay longer than he used to. He'd take his coat off. That was how I measured it. Coat on meant passing through. Coat off meant something else. I started making a joke of it in my head. Dat's coat index, I called it. 1 to 10. Coat on the chair was a 7. Coat on the hook by the door was a 9. I never told anyone that. Some things are just yours. The spring after our daughter was born, Ma'am got sick. Not the kind of sick you fix with tea and rest. The kind where you walk into the room and the air feels different. Heavier, like the house itself knows. She'd been losing weight since February, but she hid it under her apron and her shawl, and none of us saw it until she reached for a pot one afternoon, and her wrist looked like a child's. Dat didn't say the word. Nobody did at first. She went to see Dr. Graber in town, and that itself was a thing, because Ma'am hadn't been to an English doctor in probably 15 years. She came back with a paper bag of pills she set on the counter and stared at like they were written in a language she didn't trust. She took them for 11 days. Then she stopped. She went back to her teas. She went back to the raspberry leaf and the nettle, and the burdock root she'd been pulling from the ditch bank behind the barn since before I was born. The big leaves, the ones that grow wider than a man's hand by late June, dark green on top and silver gray underneath, with that woolly texture like felt. She boiled them, she drank the water, she laid the softened leaves across her stomach where the pain lived, and wrapped them with a cotton cloth and pinned it with a safety pin that had a tiny spot of rust on the hinge. I know because I watched her do it. I watched her do it every evening for 2 months. Did it work? That's what you want to know. That's what everyone wants to know. And the honest answer is, I don't know. I don't know what worked and what didn't, and what was the pills she took for 11 days, and what was the burdock, and what was just her body deciding it wasn't done yet. What I know is that by June she was eating again. By August she was canning tomatoes and standing at the stove long enough to make a full batch of chow chow. By October she was walking to the mailbox and back without stopping. The English doctor said her numbers improved. Ma'am said the leaves drew the poison out. I stood between those 2 sentences my whole life, and I never found solid ground. I'm still standing there. I think maybe that's where I'm supposed to stand. That's what the old ones knew, that sometimes the healing isn't one thing. Sometimes it's the tea and the pills and the prayer and the stubborn refusal to lay down. Sometimes the remedy is just a woman deciding she's not finished yet. Amos's older brother, the one with the cabinet shop on the Ridge Road, he told me once, during a barn raising over in Reedsville, that his mother used to make a salve from comfrey root and lard and a little beeswax. She'd grind the root with a mortar and pestle, the stone kind, heavy, took both hands. She made it for broken bones, actual broken bones. Jonas said when he was 14 he fell from the haymow and snapped his forearm. You could see the bump under the skin, and his mother set it with 2 cedar shingles and wrapped it and then packed that comfrey salve around it thick as butter and changed it every day for 3 weeks. He never went to a doctor. The arm healed. He held it up for me to see, turned it in the light, and there was a slight curve to it, just barely, like a creek that bends around a rock. "Works fine," he said. "Made cabinets for 30 years with this arm." And then he picked up his hammer and went back to the beam he was setting, and that was the end of the conversation. 7 words. That's how men in my community shared medical history. 7 words and a hammer. I told Rebecca about Dat's visit, about the pot, about what he said, that night after the baby was asleep. We were sitting on the bed and she was rubbing arnica oil into her hands because the dry winter air had cracked her knuckles open, and the room smelled like that sharp herbal smell arnica has. almost peppery. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "Your dad has been carrying that a long time." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Are you going to carry it too, or are you going to put it down?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't know how. Where I come from, a man doesn't put things down. He builds a shelf. He puts it on the shelf. He walks past it every day. That's what carrying looks like, when you're taught that carrying is the only option. 4 winters later, I was 30, and Mam had been well for 2 years, and Dad had started something I never expected. He started bringing herbs to our house. He'd show up with a handful of dried chamomile from Mam's garden, or a jar of elderberry syrup she'd put up in September, and he'd set it on the table without explanation and say something like, "Your Mam says the children might need this," but it was him bringing it, his hands carrying it, his boots on the porch. And I understood, slowly, the way you understand anything that matters, that this was his language, not words, not "I love you" or "I'm sorry" or "I should have held you when you were born." Chamomile, elderberry, a jar set on a table. That was his whole vocabulary, and he was using every word he had. The moment I understood, really understood, not just in my head but in my chest, in my hands, in the part of me that still flinched when Dat walked into a room, was an evening 3 years ago. I was reading, not something Amish men do a lot of, to be honest, but Rebecca had brought home a book from a yard sale in Lewistown, a book about herbal traditions in different cultures, and there was a chapter on postpartum care, and it described what red raspberry leaf does, how it tones the uterus, how it helps with bleeding, how it's been used by midwives for centuries across continents, how the tannins and the fragrine work on the smooth muscle. And I sat there in the kitchen, same table, same lamp hissing on the wall, and I thought, Mam knew. She didn't know the word fragarin, she didn't know the Latin, but she knew. Her mother knew. Her mother's mother knew. They passed it hand to hand like a loaf of bread, and none of them needed a book to tell them it was real. And I grieved. I grieved for the boy who stood at the sink washing a clean glass because he was afraid to hold his own daughter. I grieved for Dat, who touched a teapot like it was a door he'd lost the key to. I grieved for Gross Daddy Eli, who probably never once held Dat when he was born and carried that absence like a stone in his back pocket for 81 years until he died in the bed he was born in the house his father built, with the smell of chamomile drying in the attic above him. That's what the old ones knew. They knew the plants, they knew the healing, but they didn't always know how to let it reach the ones standing right beside them. The grief isn't sharp anymore. It's more like a weather pattern. It comes. I let it come. I let it sit at the table. I even make it tea. I know how that sounds, but I do. When I feel it, I brew the raspberry leaf, and I sit with it, and I let the smell take me back to that January kitchen, and I hold both things at once, the beauty of what the women carried and the ache of what the men couldn't. There are 3 gifts this life gave me that I will never set down. The first is the smell of burdock leaves steeping in water, that green, mineral, living smell that means someone in this house is being taken care of. The second is the sound of a remedy being made, the spoon against the pot, the pour of hot water, the creak of the cabinet where the tinctures live. That sound is the sound of love in a language older than English or Dutch or any words at all. The third is my father's hand on a warm pot. 5 seconds, 1 touch. The entire unsaid history of the men in my family, held in an open palm. The truth is this: healing dressed in silence still heals, but it heals slower, and it leaves marks it doesn't have to leave. And the women in my community, Mam, Rebecca, Gross Mammy, Sarah Yoder, with her steady hands, they knew that the body and the heart are not separate patients. The tea was never just tea. The poultice was never just a poultice. It was permission. Permission to be tended. Permission to be seen in your weakness. Permission to need someone. The men didn't have that permission. We had endurance. And endurance kept us alive, but it didn't keep us whole. If you grew up somewhere your grandfather's hands knew more medicine than his mouth knew words, I see you. If you watched your mother heal what your father wouldn't name, I see you. If you've ever stood at a sink pretending to be busy because feeling something real in front of someone you loved felt more dangerous than any sickness, I see you. And if you're still carrying the silence, if you inherited the stone and you don't know how to set it down, you are not broken. You are the son of sons who did their best with what they had. And the fact that you're here, listening, wondering if there's another way, that's the first remedy. That's the tea on the table. That's the hand on the warm pot. If you're the one still inside the community, holding the old ways and the old silence both, I see you. If you're the one who left, and sometimes drives past the farm at dusk just to smell the air, I see you. If you're English and something in this story pulled at a thread you didn't know was loose, I see you. If your grandmother knew a remedy she never wrote down, and now it's gone, and you feel that loss like a missing tooth, I see you. If you lost someone that no medicine, old or new, could save, I see you. Wherever you are in this, I see you. And you are not alone. Tell me in the comments, what did your family carry? A tea? A poultice? A salve? A prayer said over a wound? I want to hear it. Write it down before it disappears. There is so much more I haven't said yet. There are remedies I haven't been ready to share, but I'm getting closer. If you want to walk this road with me, subscribe to Rebecca's Husband. This is where the old ways get spoken out loud, maybe for the first time. And if a super chat or a membership feels right to you, that's you saying these stories matter, that the remedies deserve remembering, and I carry that with me every time I sit down to speak. The body remembers what the mouth never said. Let it.